Teamwork isn't just nice to have in business, it's the undisputed competitive advantage. When your team members work as a unified force, your whole operation benefits through higher productivity, thriving creativity, and unstoppable momentum. Welcome to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast, where we share with you strategies and tactics to help you develop game-changing teams so that you and your business can make a real difference in the world.
Welcome, and today I'm going to share a story with you on impactful teamwork. So my name's Julia Felton, I'm your host and guide again, and we are going to be delving into the topic of reinvention. So many of you might remember that 2 weeks ago, the podcast was all about reinvention or extinction and how reinvention is such an important attribute in our toolkit today, and how leaders are spending approximately now 50% of their time reinventing. And by reinvention, we mean taking the best from the past and adapting that for the future. And I think we can all agree that we live in a world where we need to continually be adapting and reinventing our businesses. And there are a throw of businesses that haven't stayed current, haven't reinvented, and we have seen them disappear off the high street. I remember in the old days, I was a loyal advocate of my Nokia phone. And I had those for ages and ages. And nowadays, Nokia phones don't really exist. The same with Blockbuster videos. They didn't see the advent of the internet, streaming films, and of course were taken over, not literally taken over, but Netflix took that position in the marketplace and have expanded from just being a provider of originally films to actually producing and having a whole commercial arm around filmmaking. This topic of reinvention is so important that I wanted to just delve into it a bit more again today. And I was going to share with you a story because I know the power of stories and how they can really change how you hear something. So I thought, let's explain reinvention with a story. And this is a story that you will know very well. But I want to look at it through the lens of reinvention and what we can learn from this story. And the story is all about the sinking of the Titanic. So, the sinking of the Titanic. I just want you to imagine this. It's the 14th of April, 1912. And it's about 10 to 12 in the evening. And the Royal Mail steamer ship Titanic is en route from Southampton to New York. And we all know what happens. It unfortunately collides with an iceberg and sinks within 3 hours. And this led to the death of nearly 1,500 people. And that was about 2/3 of the passengers on the boat. And I think a lot of us, when we think about the sinking of the Titanic, we're like, that was just something very unfortunate. It was unfortunate, it hit an iceberg and the boat sank. But actually, there were at least 6 warning signs that potentially a problem could happen on this trip. And this is what I want to unpack for you today so that you can see how within business, there are always warning signs of things coming up on the horizon. It's just that we have to pay attention to them and notice them so that we can take action. And many of you will know I'm a massive advocate of attention being a leadership superpower that is massively underused right now, because most of us are so distracted by what's about to happen in the future, what happened in the past. Very few people actually in the now really paying attention to what's going on. So let's look at these 6 clues that were given to us that, if we had heeded their warning, could have prevented the Titanic sinking. And the first one actually happened just before the ship left Southampton. Because what happened was the second officer, David Blair, he was at the last minute taken off of the ship and replaced. So there was a leadership change last minute on the boat. And of course, he was very disappointed about being taken off the boat. But this is what the most important thing was. he, in all of the melee of this happening so quickly, didn't do a handover. And as a result of not having that handover, he didn't give his keys to the replacement who took his position on the ship. And as we'll find out later, those keys unlocked a very important cabinet on the ship. The second thing that happened was there were no binoculars on board. So the two lookouts up in the crow's nest, looking out for danger, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, they worked on a 2-hour shift. So it's not like they had been up there a long time and were tired. In fact, they hadn't actually been on shift very long. And the way that they had to get everyone's attention about anything they saw was with a large bell and a telephone that rang up on the captain's bridge. But the one thing that they were missing was a pair of binoculars. And obviously, as we know, binoculars enable us to see far into the distance. The important reason is, why didn't they have the binoculars? They didn't have the binoculars because the binoculars were in that cabinet and the keys were the ones that Second Officer David Blair still had on shore. So nobody even thought laterally to think, oh, we don't have any binoculars. They're in this cabinet. We need to break the lock and get in. Everyone just carried on, and we did without the resources that we needed. So no binoculars on the ship. The third thing that happened was that nobody was taking responsibility for health and safety on the ship. There were no safety drills run to make sure everybody knew what to do in case of emergency. And the real irony is, on actually the day of the sinking, the captain cancelled the 11 a.m. emergency evacuation procedure with no explanation. And as a result of us not having practiced and knowing what our plan B was, if the ship was to go down, nobody knew what to do, because nobody had run through, nobody had embodied, nobody had experienced the safety drill. The fourth thing that happened was that, unfortunately, when the ship had been designed, nobody thought it could sink. So in fact, there were insufficient life rafts on the vessel. So indeed, when the Titanic did hit the iceberg and people were trying to be getting off the ship, A, there were insufficient life rafts for everyone to get onto a life raft. And B, because people weren't aware of what they had to do, a lot of the life rafts were let go from the ship without having their full capacity on it. We compounded the problem by not maximizing the resource that we did have, just because people didn't know what to do. The fifth warning sign that happened was that a very important message wasn't passed along to the captain. So if you imagine this, the Titanic is leaving in 1912. It's full of a lot of wealthy people traveling to America, many for the first time. Crew of the Titanic were more concerned with providing excellent customer service than they were on the health and safety of the passengers, partly because they believed that the Titanic would never sink. So what was happening in the telex room was a lot of the operators there were sending a lot of messages to New York to get things in place for the passengers of the ship when they got there. And as a result of that, the senior radio operator, John George, often known as Jack Phillips, missed a message that was prefixed with the words MSG, which means Master's Servicegram. And it requires a personal acknowledgement for the captain. But because Phillips was so busy trying to sort out things for the first-class passengers on the ship, he interpreted the message as not urgent, and it didn't get passed to the captain. And this was really important because the message actually advised the captain of icebergs en route. And then the final thing that happened, the final twist of fate, was that the first officer, William McMaster Murdoch, was left in charge of the ship. So he was at the helm at the time of the sinking. He was 39 years old and he had 16 years maritime experience behind him. And he was well known for being a cool head with quick thinking and professional judgment. In fact, he was really well known for having a great track record of averting ship collision. So you can imagine your first officer, William McMaster Murdoch, and you get notified the ship's coming up to an iceberg. And so in your cool head, you do what you've done 100 times before, is that you turn the ship to avert the iceberg. So he went into the pattern of what he'd done previously that had worked. Unfortunately, in this particular incident, the Titanic was too close to the iceberg. So what actually happened was, as they turned the ship to avert the crisis, they actually smashed into the iceberg side on. And a lot of the literature suggests that actually that compounded the sinking of the boat. And actually, if they had hit head on, then there would have been a greater chance of survival. So let's just recap then. 6 different things that didn't happen that caused or contributed, should I say, to the sinking of the Titanic. So the first was there was no handover. And how often do we see that in organizations? No handovers between team members, no handovers when people leave the organization. And this can be the thing that brings the ship down because nobody knows what's going on. Actually, and I think about, as I'm sharing this, of a particular situation I had where I had an IT director running part of my business when I was in corporate. And it was during the time of the Enron fallout. And in this particular case, my IT programmer here, he didn't actually sit on my payroll. He sat on a central payroll. And obviously with the company imploding, what happened was all the central payroll was let go. So he came in and he told me one day his role was being made redundant. I literally had 1 day handover between the time that this gentleman left and me managing to cobble around some resource to replace him in order to get a handover. Without that handover, I know hand on heart, my complete division would have crashed and burned. So this is the important handover between team members within the business. It's also handovers when one company is acquired by another. So no handovers was the first problem. The second problem was no binoculars. So there was no equipment or the incorrect equipment that was needed at that time. And how often do we see that in business? We're asking team members to work and do things with the incorrect equipment. And I've got to say, on some of the catering events I do, particularly when we're doing them outside in fields, we often don't have the right equipment. But it is amazing when you know you've not got the right equipment, how inventive you can be if you know you have to be to find a solution. The third thing that happened was that there was no practice. There was no plan B, what to do in case of emergency. And again, this is something that we always need to be aware of in business. What is our plan B? What can we do differently if things don't go to plan? And I always think in today's environment, not only do we need a plan B, we often need C, D, and E there so that we know what to do. And our team are familiar with what these alternatives are and then how to put them into place if required. The fourth lesson we learned was the fact that we can't be complacent. When the Titanic was built, as I said, there were insufficient life rafts on there. The designers, the builders were too complacent. They thought the ship would never sink. And so they've put some resources on in terms of lifeboats, but insufficient. So we had insufficient resources really to effectively do the job. So that's really important because I see that happening a lot in businesses, the insufficient resources because senior leadership thinks something won't happen. The fifth lesson that we can learn is that we need to always be focused on the right thing and not the wrong thing. So the telex operators were focused on providing amazing customer service, which is great. But because nobody was focusing on the health and safety, many of the passengers who they were providing amazing customer service to never got to their destination to experience it. So it's really important that in business, we're always focusing on the most important thing. And it's very easy to get distracted and focus on the wrong thing, and therefore we don't get the success we want. And lastly, the lesson to take away is that we need to be very careful about relying on past success, because past success is not a measure of future success. And we saw that with the first officer, William McMaster Murdoch, because actually he was relying on his past success of averting collisions. And in this particular case, it didn't happen. And we've seen this also with many businesses where they're like, we can never go down. We are invincible. And yet we've seen those companies implode. We only have to look at the last banking crisis back in 2008, where a huge number of companies went down, large companies, and nobody thought that would happen. So this whole concept that I've just shared with you in this story is what we actually call Titanic Syndrome. And it is a corporate disease in which organizations facing disruption bring about their own downfall through arrogance, excessive attachment to past successes, or the inability to recognize new and emerging reality. So, my request and my invitation for you today as a business is please be aware of Titanic Syndrome in your organization. What is it that you're not paying attention to that could inadvertently take your business down? What is the iceberg out there that could harm your business? So I hope you've enjoyed those thoughts. I hope you've enjoyed the story of Titanic. And it's really brought to life the whole reason about why we need to reinvent and how easy it can be to miss the opportunities and the need for reinvention. And if we're not careful, we end up sinking like the Titanic. So until next week, have an amazing time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Impactful Teamwork Podcast. Please stay tuned for future episodes and do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating on your favorite platform. Recommendations are essential for attracting new listeners. Please follow us on social media at Julia Felton and @Business Horsepower. And if there are any topics you'd like us to cover on future episodes, please do let me know. Remember, you and your team are always making an impact. What impact will you make today?